Hello, everyone. I hope you can see us and hear us. I want to welcome everyone to our webinar. And I want to thank you for joining us. This is our spring update for the Whale Sanctuary Project. And I am Lori Marino, the president, and I'm joined by our executive director, Charles Vinick. Today, we'd like to provide you with an update on our progress in Nova Scotia, the challenges we face, and answer as many questions as we can about what we are doing and what we hope to accomplish in the coming year. We'd like to start out by addressing the recent death of Kiska, the lone orca at Marineland, who passed away on March 10th. What we know is that he was sick for some time and eventually died of a bacterial infection. But we don't know much more than that because having information about her depends on Marineland's transparency. And so we have many, along with you, we have many unanswered questions about what happened to Kiska. Kiska was someone who was very special to me. I visited her a few years ago at Marineland, and her situation was nothing less than heartbreaking. I wanted to find a way to eventually bring her to sanctuary. But that idea is based on the fact that we would have to collaborate with Marineland. They owned Kiska and they had custody of Kiska. And even if her sanctuary was completed and ready to welcome her, there would have been no path to doing that without the consent and cooperation of Marineland. And that is a hard truth about rescue and the sanctuary world. But I think about her every day. And I have to remember that there are still about 35 beluga whales at Marineland, some of whom may be able to come to our sanctuary when it is completed. And we continue to do everything we can to keep the lines of communication open with Marineland so we can talk about that possibility. Now, some of you know that the mayor of Niagara Falls, Jim Diodati, has announced that Marineland is up for sale and that he is committed to the welfare of the animals there. We will hold him to that promise and continue to appeal to Marineland to join us in helping as many whales as we can. Also, we continue to support the Jane Goodall bill, which is in its second reading in the Senate and will be voted in the fall. And if passed, it is possible that it could provide some limited legal standing for captive cetaceans, but we will still see the best route to bringing belugas to our sanctuary is cooperation, communication, and collaboration with Marineland. So starting with that, I'd like to turn things over to Charles.
Well, thank you, Lori. I want to, first of all, say hello to everyone. I'm grateful that you're here. I'm actually in our visitor center in Sherbrooke. I've been here for a few days working on various aspects of the sanctuary work. Be in Halifax the next couple of days as well, meeting with a number of people. But I think what's best is let's take a moment. I want to share my screen and see if I can pull up this little bit of slideshow to show you. And let me just go with that. So I hope you can see that. And what I wanted to do is kind of center us about what we're talking about. So by bringing up this rendering that many of you have seen of the sanctuary in Port Hilford Bay. So what we're looking at, just to set the stage, if we will, for our conversation, is 100 acres of water space enclosed in the net that's depicted by the dotted line. Our lease from the Department of Natural Resources and Renewables is really for 205 acres of water space. And that's because it needs to have room for a buffer zone where no boats can come. It has to have room for the anchors from the nets and the like, and include part of Bereshwa Island, the island there in the upper part of the screen. So this is just a rendering, but it does show you, and we'll talk more about where our buildings will be by the wharf that already exists. That's a fishing wharf that is there. And those buildings, and really 3 buildings, a veterinary building, an animal care staff building, maintenance and net loft, and then the administrative work that has to go on as well. They may be 3 buildings, it may be 1 building connected that way, but really 3 different functions. And the design work going on for that we'll talk about in a minute. So then you see Bereshwa Pond, that pond in the back that's basically brackish, surrounded by trees, and all of that land by the buildings, by the trees in the foreground, the pond, coming around to this side of the net over in this area, if you can see my cursor. And all that land is 30 acres of land that we have in escrow to be purchased at the appropriate time. So we'll talk more about that, but that just gives you the mental image of what we're talking about. And then if I can go to the next slide, wanted to give you a sense of where we are, because I think one of the questions that many of you have, and that all of us have, is why does this take so long? I mean, we've been at this for a number of years. Many of you are frustrated. I don't know that any of you could be more frustrated than we are by that time. And I apologize for my voice. You'll hear it go in and out. I've been on phones and interviews a lot in the last week or so, as we'll talk more about. But really, I just want to walk around, if you will, these pictures, because they describe what we're doing. And certainly all of this has to do with permitting and leasing of the water space for the leasing side and permitting for both the water and the land side. So certainly the main aspect of that work is with government agencies. So who are the government agencies involved? On the federal side, it's primarily Transport Canada and DFO, Department of Fisheries and Oceans. On the provincial side, it's primarily the Department of Natural Resources and Renewables, the Department of Environment, and then also engagement with those entities, with some of the federal agencies, because DFO overlaps with some of that provincial work as well. And then certainly, what's the work that goes into the agencies that we're providing? Well, some of it is simply geotechnical mapping. What's the interest of Transport Canada? The interest of Transport Canada is, how will our nets impact any navigational interests of other stakeholders in this area? So all that work with Transport Canada has already been accomplished. They don't see any major issues, and so things are going well with that. With DFO, there are a number of things in terms of both the environment, but particularly the DFO interest is subsequent to where we are now in who are the whales that will come, where will they come from, what kind of permits will need to be issued for each individual whale. So that work tends to wait until we're further along, but certainly now we're engaged with them as to whether or not fish and fish habitat permits are needed and things like that we're discussing with them. Most importantly, what we've been doing over the really last 2.5 years are environmental studies and analyses, both at land and in the ocean. We've been taking water quality analyses seasonally throughout every season for more than 2 years. All of the results of the water tests are very positive. We've not seen any kind of issues that are concerning, and certainly none that are showstoppers. We've had divers that have done work to do research on the submerged soil, both for ourselves and for the Department of Environment. We've also engaged in 3 different environmental site analyses, environmental site in what's called an ESA 1, an ESA Site Assessment 1, an ESA Site Assessment 2, and most recently, a Site Assessment 3. Now, that's the work that is, I think, perhaps most important to many of you, and certainly very important to us. Now, the work that's been done on the land side, that's all this area back up in here, has been the most focus of the ESA 2 and the ESA 3. Why? Because this is an area of land that is well known as former gold mine sites. So there was gold mining here between the 1880s, the 1930s. There are a number of gold mine shafts that still exist on this land. And there's also a mill, a gold stamp mill that exists or formerly existed there. So you need to do the studies to understand, are there any residual metals in any of this land? Has any of that metal leached into the water and the submerged soils in the water column? And what impact might that have on any future uses of the land? Now, that's not unique to our site. It's happened in many sites all over Nova Scotia. Many of those sites have been developed, and certainly there's an ongoing effort throughout Nova Scotia to remediate any of these former gold mine sites. So what have we found? We've looked at some 21 different metal elements in these analyses, and it is the case that certainly there is iron, there's some manganese, and there's certainly some arsenic. Now, arsenic is a scary term. That's the one that always kind of gives me, makes you go pale, makes you wonder what's going on. And is it a crisis? Is it something we should say we can't do anything here about or not? And certainly that's also a concern about manganese, and it can be a concern about the iron. The reality is that in many sites all over Nova Scotia, those same residual metals have been found. And there is a standard practice for remediating the site and mitigating the impacts of those metals. Our consultants and our discussions with the government do not suggest that these are at a level that that would prevent us from doing any mitigation and remediation. Now, we don't yet know the extent of what will be necessary in terms of remediation and mitigation. Our consultants have said, basically, we can do that with additional soil, with gravel in some places, and that where we're going to put buildings, we need to be particularly concerned that we do that kind of soil coverage. In other areas, out in some of these areas by the pond or up in areas where we're not using the site, we may simply avoid that part of the soil and that part of the land. But there basically is a complete mitigation strategy to come out of the ESA 3 analysis that we will engage in with our consultants and with the government to move forward. So are these issues of concern? You bet. Are they issues that cause us to say we can't proceed? From everything we know, no. And from everything we've been told, we should proceed exactly as we are. So does it take time? Yes. Has it taken more time than we might like? Certainly. But we're moving forward with all of it, and we will continue to do so. As we go forward and kind of walk our way around these little pictures, we've been doing geotechnical engineering. That's done in order to prepare for where we're going to bring power, where we're going to put in our water systems, where we'll drill for wells, where we will actually put our septic system, all back in that land, kind of behind the government building image that we have here. Simultaneously, we've engaged architects and designers to begin to build the buildings, to begin to design the buildings for building. And why is all this going on here? It's because this is what prepares us to break ground. We cannot break ground until we work our way through all of this work. So rather than waiting until we get all our permits, we've actually begun that design work for the nets and for the buildings that we'll have on site. We're also fundraising at all times. I think many of you have heard in the latter part of 2022, the Wendy P. McCaw Foundation made a commitment for $5 million. We're now looking to match that $5 million so that we can begin to have sufficient funds, $10 to $12 million, so that we're prepared to really move forward expeditiously on the building as soon as we have the permits and the leases in hand. As I say, we have the lease, what's called a Crown land lease for all of the submerged land, but it requires a number of conditions before it is exercised, and those conditions include the permitting. Similarly, as I mentioned earlier, we have the land in an option to purchase, and in fact, all the funds for the purchase of the land are in escrow, but there's no reason, and we can't exercise that escrow, again, until the permits are in hand. That would be inappropriate for the donors who have given the funds for the land. We're also in the midst of First Nation consultation. First Nation consultation takes place between the government and the Mi'kmaq. We are the proponent, but we're not actually engaged in that consultation. It takes place between, well, I've done one too quickly, sorry. It takes place between the governments, between the government of the Mi'kmaq and the government of Canada. And it's really handled by the provincial government. We've been engaged in many of those discussions. We've contracted for an environmental study that's required for it. My understanding, that's been a year in the works, and I'm told by the company that is doing that is Geomatics company that's doing that work, that they finished it, but they haven't finished the write-up, and they anticipate the write-up within a couple of weeks. So we're in the process of completing First Nation consultation. It's been about a 15-month process so far, and we anticipate it will be completed soon. Again, all of the discussions we've had about it are very supportive. There are no issues that have been raised that we are aware of. We did have to do an archaeological resource impact analysis study in December, and that was finished and identified 3 areas that there are potentially some artifacts that we need to be concerned about, but those are not 3 areas that we'll be using on the site, so we don't anticipate disturbing them in any way. And then all of this goes on with community consultation at every level. Community consultation at government level, community locally, and provincially or provincial wide. And that's not something that frankly ever ends. We anticipate that will continue for the life of the project because yes, we're creating the project, but it should be a project that is managed hand in hand with the communities in which we reside. So I just wanted to give you kind of general overview of what's going on. It is a long process. It is not over. And when it's over, then we can break ground. We can't break ground whether we have all the money in the bank or not until all of these processes are completed. And certainly I expect you'll have many questions about it, and both Lori and I will be happy to respond to them. So just before we jump to questions, Lori can talk about not only the things that we're doing directly around the sanctuary, but what happens with the rest of our work as the Whale Sanctuary Project in relation to what we're doing for the sanctuary.
Yes, thank you, Charles. Let me just tell you about a few things that you see here: community connection and what's going on in Parliament, educational outreach, which is just unbelievable. I'm very excited to tell you about that. And also accreditation. So just to start with community connection, As some of you know, we have an operations and visitor center in Sherbrooke, and we continue to have hundreds of visitors per year come in and learn about whales and learn about the sanctuary and express their support, and we answer all of their questions. There are also, in addition to that, and Charles, you might want to talk a little bit more about some of the smaller meetings that you're constantly engaged in with some of the folks in the community.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've certainly had a number of town meetings, both here in each of the communities, Wine Harbor, Port Hilford, and Sherbrooke, that are really the three surrounding communities in this area around the sanctuary. But also, you meet with individuals, we meet with individual stakeholders. I had a meeting today with a number of the fishermen and number of the tomorrow I'm meeting with one of the ministers and with our MLA. So these are all different ways that we communicate with both stakeholders, community representatives, and the local government, because all of them have impact on this project. In addition to the kinds of permitting we've spoken about, there's all kinds of local zoning. And one of the really, I think, exciting things that happened more than a year ago is that the local community, the municipality of St. Mary's, created a whale sanctuary zone in this area that really will facilitate the zoning we have to do locally. So all of that will help with the building permits. I mean, you have the big permits for environment and the like, but you also need building permits just like you do to build a home. So all of those things are things that we've been discussing on a regular basis. We move forward with incrementally as we move forward with all of this. And Laura, you may want to chat a little bit about what we're doing with the Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries.
The Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries is really the only accrediting entity in the world, with the exception of a couple for primates like NAPSA, that actually accredits sanctuaries. In other words, they are the organization that looks at a sanctuary for any kind of animal and verifies and accredits them according to very stringent criteria of animal welfare. And we're incredibly proud to say that after, I think it's at least 2 years now of work with the National Aquarium and Sea Life Trust, we have developed the first set of accrediting criteria for cetacean sanctuaries. And we submitted those to Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries, GFAS, and they will be adopting them and announcing them sometime in June. So please stay tuned for that. It's another example of how different organizations of different stripes can come together and work together for the benefit of the animals. And these accreditation guidelines will allow everyone to be able to distinguish between an authentic sanctuary for cetaceans and one that's just calling itself a sanctuary. And that's, as you know, critically important. So we're really, really happy to complete that work and have it roll out in the next couple of months. A couple of other things, we continue to be grateful for the Canadian Parliament's ongoing support for our work and for whale protective legislation in general. In the past year, we've been mentioned by Senator Mary Coyle, Senator Marty Klyne, who reintroduced the Jane Goodall bill and mentioned our scientific work, and recently Senator Jane Cordy. And so we very much appreciate all of the parliamentary engagements that continues in support of our work. And then finally, I want to tell you about some of the educational outreach that we've been engaged in, because it has just been absolutely phenomenal. And as you know, this is also about the next generations coming up and how they relate to whales and dolphins and other animals. And we've been working with several teachers in Canada and the United States. And I want to just mention a couple and give them a shout out. One of them is Judith Goldberg, who's a school principal in Ontario, Canada. And she's been creating educational programs with some of her teachers about whales in captivity and sanctuaries. And her students range from kindergarten to grade 6. And they were advocating for Kiska for a very long time. And since Kiska's passing, they wanted to know how they can help the belugas get out of marine land and into sanctuaries. They've been writing letters, signing petitions to Parliament, working with senators, doing all kinds of engagement and outreach. So they've been just tremendous. And it's wonderful to see young students like this so committed. Also, another shout out to a 4th grade teacher at Schuler Elementary School in Texas, Rachel Friend. And she's involved her students over the past several years in learning about whales in captivity and sanctuary. She's even designed a whole curriculum called Wild for Whales. And she's collaborated with art teachers in her school and she's fundraised, designed, and put on and fundraised for the sanctuary to raise awareness about whales through the children's art and create conversations about whale and dolphin captivity. It's just tremendous work. And finally, Maureen Austin, a teacher in Arkansas, who's been teaching the natural history of orcas and captivity for the past 12 years. And her students have been involved in petitioning the USDA to reevaluate the health of tokite at the Miami Aquarium. So this should, I hope it makes everyone as happy as it makes me to know that our project has engaged the next generation in scholar advocacy, and they have showed a tremendous commitment to making a change in our relationship with whales and dolphins and hopefully other animals as well. So thank you guys.
So with that, I think we can begin to get to some of your questions. There are quite a few, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. One of them that I saw come in, actually, I think it came in even before the webinar started, is can the Canadian government fast track the sanctuary? And let me say that you're not the first to ask. I've asked the same question, and I don't actually know the answer. I mean, certainly the government can have a huge influence, but how exactly to do that remains a question. So one of the things we have engaged is with a number of parliamentarians and asked if they can assist in fast tracking any of the permit reviews, so that in some ways in Canada, with the passage of S203, the bill to prohibit keeping whales and dolphins in captivity, that was kind of a global leadership role in legislation. And now we see with the Jane Goodall bill, a further movement in that same direction. So in some ways, in my mind, when a sanctuary gets built in Nova Scotia, it completes an arc, if you will, of the legislation and a solution to what the legislation is talking about. So one of the things we've been talking about with the government is, could this be a special project for the nation as well as for the province? Because it makes sense for it to be that. Now, there isn't such a thing. That's a made-up idea of ours. But it sure makes a lot of sense if we could figure out a way for the government to engage with us in that. So it's a discussion we're having, but it's not one that has solid path from A to B at this stage. The other part of the question that was asked is, if the government were to fast track the sanctuary and to help us do that, could they in turn force marine land to move belugas from marine land to the sanctuary? And I think that's a more difficult question, because as Lori spoke about earlier, about the rules around custody, because in fact, marine land does have custody of these animals. So the extent to which that custody can be forced in some way to be, if you will, changed or jeopardized or compromised, depending on your point of view, for the government to force a move would depend on what violations or laws the government could use to make such an impact on custody. So I think that's a more difficult question. It's frankly one that I don't have the answer to. And so far, I haven't seen that the government has been engaged that way with marine land. Rather, what I would hope to see is an opportunity to work with marine land, because I think that's the way the custody issue gets dealt with. It gets dealt with if we and marine land, or any other entity and marine land, could come together and say, okay, we want to work together for the next step for these animals. And whether it's marine land or any other marine park, I think it's those kinds of relationships that will enable animals to be moved to sanctuary. That's what we've seen in our discussions with 2 aquaria in South Korea. Those aquariums are ready to move their animals. They're looking for how to make partnerships with entities that could take them. And we're one of the ones that they're in discussion with. That's the kind of discussion I think that's needed. So it's not so much about what government can force, although where there are violations, certainly the government should. But more importantly, if sanctuaries are going to exist and animals are going to move out of marine parks and aquariums, it needs to happen through partnership. It needs to happen through respect. It needs to happen through clear communication and a willingness to work together on the areas we can come to agreement on, rather than focusing on the areas we don't agree on. So that's it's a long answer to a short question, but it's partly what I see, and truthfully, because of the work we've been involved in with Toki, with Tokatai, the Miami Seaquarium. That's come about, and there are some questions about that, and we'll get to them. It's come about because of partnership building, relationship building with the Dolphin Company and Eduardo Elmore, who opened his heart and his mind and his company to joining with a bunch of us to try to do something for Lolita, for Tokatai. So we'll talk more about that. Lori.
I just wanted to mention too, because there might be some newcomers here in the conversation, just to clarify, for our sanctuary in Nova Scotia, we will have the ability to take orcas and belugas. And the reason for that is because we have a lot of space. We would separate them, but those are the 2 species that would be potentially in residence in our sanctuary: beluga whales and orcas. Probably more beluga whales than orcas. Not bottlenose dolphins, but orcas. They are dolphins, but orcas and beluga whales. So I saw a couple of questions about that. Just wanted to clarify that.
What are the other? I think there are probably 5 or 6 questions that have been asked, and some that all relate to when will we break ground? When will we reopen? Why does Charles always say it's tomorrow and tomorrow never comes? And then a couple of answers to that question. One, certainly we've now been saying 2024. In 2019, we were saying 2021. So yes, you're correct that the date keeps shifting. Why do I always pick a date and push? And I think some of you have heard me say this before. I believe you have to have stretch goals. You have to put pressure. We have to put pressure on ourselves. We have to try to make certain timelines work while recognizing that, frankly, a lot of this is out of our control. We don't control when the permits get done. We certainly can go through all the processes as quickly as possible, but they are long. And in many cases, the agencies actually are figuring out with us what permits apply, because there's never been a project like this before. Initially, we thought all of this would happen through fisheries and aquaculture, and the government thought that. Then it shifted over to the Department of Natural Resources and Renewables. We're working through with them as diligently and as expeditiously as possible. We will continue to do that. I will continue to say we're pushing as hard as we can, and we'll put dates out there. They will continue to shift because we cannot possibly predict how long it's going to take. I'll give you an example of another group. The National Aquarium in Baltimore is working on a sanctuary for their dolphins. They have the animals. They've changed all of their tanks to look like ocean. They've brought in kelp. They've brought in different plants. They've changed the look of it. They no longer have shows, and they're acclimating their dolphin for sanctuary. They've been at it now for, I believe, 5 years, and they're looking ahead to 2026 as a timeline to move the dolphins. Now, I'm not suggesting that's the timeline for us, because we have some advantages with our site that they don't have with the sites they're looking at. Every one of these situations is different. And what I see is any one of us who's involved, the National Aquarium in Baltimore, the folks in Klettsvik Bay, Sea Life Trust in Iceland, who've tried to move 2 belugas in each summer, and hopefully again this summer they will move from shoreside into the sanctuary they're building there, ourselves here. All of these projects are complicated, they're time-consuming, they're expensive, and no one knows all the path to get them done. But what I can assure you is we're doing the work every day, and the work will continue just as aggressively as we can possibly do it, and as quickly as we can, and it takes longer than we would want. And yes, the whales are waiting, and they can't wait any longer, but we got to get it done. So that's the commitment we give you, and we'll continue to give you, and we will give you the best information we can, and we'll continue to put dates out there that are goals and objectives that we try to meet, and we try to meet to the best of our ability. Okay, so other questions that I'm seeing here, I'm just trying to scan through, and I'll get to the ones on Toki and Tokatai in just a couple of minutes. Let me just see if we've got some more here that deal directly with the sanctuary. There's a good question here from a person. What qualifications do the whales have to meet in order to be chosen to be moved here? And so I think, one of the things that you look at with all these animals is, what is their health? Who are they living with? Are there relationships that they have that you ought to bring more than one whale? You should bring those that are already living together. So I think you look at a number of factors. You look at, where are they? How are they being treated? Do they need conditioning to move from where they are to a sanctuary, which they all mostly will? What is their health? Are there any health issues that would preclude getting a permit to move them? And can those health issues be mitigated? Now, it's interesting because, you hope you will have all of that information and you would get it as well as you can. And yet there will be circumstances, and I use the example of the 5 belugas that were moved from Marineland to the Mystic Aquarium. And certainly in that instance, we would assume, and I think there's data to support, that Mystic and Marineland were working closely together for selecting the optimum animals to move. And yet 2 of them died very shortly after they were moved, and 1 of the 5, I understand, is still ill. So that's an example of, and certainly I don't have any firsthand knowledge. I don't have any idea about the background of that. But there's an example of key veterinarians were involved, lots of analysis was involved, and yet there were certainly some animals that were ill and didn't make it. So it underscores the need to have as much research in advance, to work as closely as possible with the facilities where the whales are coming from, and to understand as much about their medical history as you possibly can, and how you will deal with that, if you have to, in a sanctuary. And therefore the sanctuaries, and ours will, have to have quarantine areas to separate animals. They have to have that may need to be on shore. So it's not actually in the ocean waters. If there's an animal that is ill and might have anything that could be contagious to other animals. So that's the kind of analysis that has to be done in advance, as well as understanding their physical condition, their robustness, and how they get along with other animals. But initially, every animal that comes in would be in a smaller area than the whole sanctuary when they first arrive. You condition them slowly to the larger area. And as Lori pointed out, otherwise, you also have the ability to separate animals, and you certainly have, if you have orcas and belugas, completely separated areas for them.
It might be a good idea to clarify the fact that our sanctuary, Nova Scotia, is not the intended place for toki. That is a completely separate situation. And I could understand how those could get mixed up, but they are different. And so, Charles, if you want to say anything about that.
So let me jump into there. 27 or more questions about toki here, because she's been so much in the news. This is the whale, for any of you who don't know, who has been gone by the stage name Lolita, called Tokatai before then. For the indigenous tribes in the Pacific Northwest, she is called Scully Shakpina. But she's been in the Miami Seaquarium for approximately 53, 54 years. She is roughly 57 years old. She was captured in the Pacific Northwest in 1970, when there were a large number of captures from the southern resident pods, JK and L pod. She's a member of L pod. So she's been in the Miami Seaquarium for a very long time. There have been people who have been eager to have her moved back to her home waters for all of those years, but particularly the last 20 or 30 years. Since 1980, for a little over 40 years, she's been without another orca companion. She does have some white-sided dolphins, some lags that she has with her, one particularly now. She's had more at different times. She's had a very difficult time health-wise at various times. A couple of years ago, she was reported by the Department of Agriculture to be in difficult health standards. And that led to a number of us reaching out to the owners of the Miami Seaquarium to see if they would allow independent veterinarians to come in, evaluate her health, and report on it. When the park was sold a year ago, and the Dolphin Company took possession of the Miami Seaquarium, they agreed, and Eduardo Elbor, the CEO, the chairman, and the primary owner of the Miami Seaquarium, of the Dolphin Company, and therefore the Miami Seaquarium, agreed to having independent vets come in. And we, a group that basically was kind of just formed out of interested folks, found the independent veterinarians. We formed an organization called Friends of Lolita initially, now called Friends of Toki. We go back and forth. It's got both names. And Pritam Singh was the primary co-founder with myself of that group in order to bring in the independent vets. Pritam has put up more than $1 million over the last year to rehabilitate the water quality systems in which the tank, in which Toki is, for her water quality, for the vets, for independent trainers, and to create a collaboration that has most recently led to an announcement a week ago that the Dolphin Company would authorize Friends of Toki to begin discussions with all the federal agencies and the state agencies to facilitate a move to a netted enclosure in the Pacific Northwest, where she could continue to receive full-time care, continue to receive engagement with her trainers and enrichment, and have quality care, but in a natural seaside environment. So it's not a sanctuary of the size and scope that we're dealing with in Nova Scotia. It is designed specifically for her. It'd be 10 or 15 acres of water space, double netted, so that she's protected from other critters and they from her in any way, in terms of any pathogens, anything like that. And the veterinarians that have been caring for her have concluded that although she still has a chronic infection, she is stable enough that they think such a move would be better for her health than where she is. Now, how bad is where she is? Now, with the new water quality systems, the water, and I see some questions about the water quality is good. Now, as it gets closer to summer, the temperature will increase, but there's a new chiller system in place, about $300,000 worth of equipment to keep the water quality between the high 40s and the mid 50s in water temperature. A new ozone system to replace the chlorine system that has been used in the past. So all of that helps the water quality. Will she be moved precipitously? No. This will take a bit of time. I think there are 7 or 8 questions about how long will it take. We've heard 18 to 24 months. That's way too long. Couldn't agree more. Because Jim Irsay stepped forward earlier this month, he's the owner of the Indianapolis Colts. He has stepped forward and said he will provide all of the money for her life to move her and care for her. I spoke with him earlier today, and he confirmed all of the same. So that enables that project not to happen sequentially, but to do all the work simultaneously. So with a large team of people that he will help provide, Pritam Singh will help provide, some of us will be able to help engage with, that can happen more quickly. How quickly? It depends on the discussions with National Marine Fisheries Service, with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the state of Washington. But I think all of the people there, just as you've heard Lori and I talk about here, are going to try to do that as quickly as possible. And as we learn more in our discussions in the next 30 days with the government agencies, we'll have a better handle on how all of that can take place. So there's a commitment to do it well. There's a commitment to do it as quickly as possible and to do it responsibly so that her health is first and foremost in everyone's mind as we go forward. So I say we because I am involved in that. We, as Whale Aid within our Whale Sanctuary Project, this is something we've been involved in. And people also ask, well, geez, how can you do that and do this? And I guess my answer to that is, how can you not do both? If you have the opportunity and you're there and you're faced with whether it's a young child or a whale and you can help it, you have to do it. So therefore, we as an organization have to build our capacity. So we're hiring a project manager to help do all the work here in Nova Scotia, a Nova Scotian, to be full-time when I can't be here or Lori can't be here or whatever, to make sure we don't leave anything undone. I might also say people have asked, well, where's the money come from? If Charles is doing this, who's paying for that? Well, the answer is not a single dollar that is donated for Whale Sanctuary Project work goes to anything but Whale Sanctuary Project work. So if we're doing anything for Tokatai, then we have restricted funds that have been provided so far by Pritam Singh to pay for any work we would do, whether it's me or any one of our staff people, for Tokatai. And those funds are carefully restricted so that we don't overlap. So all of that is fiscally sound and will continue to be so in every way. And all of it is transparent. So there's no missing of funds in any way. So any questions like that, we're certainly happy to respond to as well. But let's take more. Other questions, Lori, pull some out here. Let's not.
There's a few questions about how many residents we might have in the sanctuary Nova Scotia when it's open. And again, that would be probably 6 to 8 beluga whales and 2 to 3 orcas in separate areas. Now, and what is the reason for those numbers? Well, we can't and we wouldn't want to exceed the carrying capacity of that water space, and meaning that that's the number, give or take a few, right? It's approximate, that will keep that area healthy, flushed out, and also provide the kind of space for the residents that really represents sanctuary space. So that's why we came to a very well thought out, careful assessment of the number of individuals we would be able to care for properly in the sanctuary.
There's a question here about, will there be, visitors at the whale sanctuary? How will visitors see the whales? A number of different questions about it. Where will will the visitor center in Sherbrooke, where I'm sitting, be the only way visitors can really participate? This is a visitor center that we have open now. It's a place where people can congregate, ask questions about the sanctuary. Actually, on Saturday, there'll be a big Easter event here on the grounds for children. It's a place for people to engage with us. And certainly, I anticipate it will continue to be a place for people to know they can get information about the sanctuary. On site, you have to remember that the purpose of a sanctuary is for the whales to be autonomous, for they to be independent, for they not to be interfered with in the way they have been. But of course, people want to see them. So given our site, which is quite remote, I do not, and Lori does not anticipate that the interpretation center, a much larger facility than our visitor center, would be physically on that site. It doesn't lend itself to that. There are traffic issues that I think would be in many ways insurmountable, but rather that interpretation center would probably be nearby the sanctuary, not here where I am in the visitor center, and could have ways that through video, through live camera, perhaps through overlooks, depending on where it is, that people are able to see and observe the whales, but not from the sanctuary site. So we're looking at a number of sites where that could happen. Also, on the eastern shore, there are a number of areas where there could be picnic areas that we may not have anything to do with, but others would, where there could be big eye binoculars, as they call them, telescopes and the like. So the whales can be observed without necessarily interfering with their autonomy. So we're looking at a number of approaches to that. Certainly not only the visitor center here in Sherbrooke, but also not especially directly on site of the sanctuary, because that really does have to be an area exclusively for the whales and the care staff that are caring for her.
Right. So if you go somewhere that says the fill in the blank sanctuary, and you can get in the water with the dolphins, have them ride, you can swim around with them, you can touch them, or, in the case of other animals, you can pass around baby tigers and all other things like that. Those are not sanctuaries. They don't adhere to the criteria that would make them an authentic sanctuary, because just as for all animals, a cetacean sanctuary is about the cetaceans, not about us. But at the same time, as Charles mentioned, the opportunity to really do outreach and education from a sanctuary is tremendous, because by its very existence, it is providing a model for a new way to relate to these animals, to reconcile with them, to give back to them of what we've taken from them for so many years. So there's all kinds of really neat things that we can do off-site.
Well, I want to come back to a couple of different questions about the site here in Nova Scotia and the like. I want to come back to be sure we really attend to that question, or those questions that, why did we select this site if it's got these kind of environmental issues? What about hurricanes and the like? But with respect to hurricanes, there have now been 3 hurricanes in the time that we've been looking at this particular site. And what I will say about each one of those is they have reinforced for us why this is a good site to have chosen. Now, were there problems? Certainly, there were trees down in the area. There was a lot of wind and the like. But if you look back or think back to the image we put up on the screen at the beginning, and the fact that you have Bereshaw Island that is out there, and you have the land that is protecting from the southwest, and you have land also protecting from the northwest, this is a site that does tend to have a lot of wind out in the big bay. But actually, during these storms, you've not had major waves in the area that we're saying would be the sanctuary. So the particular positioning of the nets is designed because it is a protected area based on all the hydrodynamic studies we've done of the area. So it's not without planning that net design is as it is depicted in these images. So I think it's a good site with respect to storms. Will there be storms? Of course. Can we predict none of them will ever come in? No. But as we look at this site, there are ways for the animals to come into shelter by Bereshaw Island, and we'll have ways that they have moved in. These are animals that are trained. They will come back to where you need to put them during storm conditions. And all of that is part and parcel of the planning ahead. With respect to the site being a former gold mining site and the like, yes, we've known about that. We've also looked into it extensively as to whether that would be a showstopper for the project. And everything we know to date says that it will not be. And that any issues that we have, as I said earlier, can be remediated and mitigated. And that's not uncommon throughout Nova Scotia for developments everywhere, because there has been a lot of gold mining here. So these are areas of certainly not, well, they're areas of concern that need to be planned and dealt with. And that's what's being done. So I think they're good questions. They're appropriate questions. They shouldn't be shied away from. And we will continue to respond and answer them as we have the data to do so. So I think all of this is what we're doing going forward. It's not a straight line to get anything like this done. It never is. But I do think we're moving down that path as effectively as we can, and we'll continue to do so.
A question about, would we bring in a single whale or a whale in pairs? I mean, obviously, the ideal situation would be to bring whales in pairs, a mother and a child, for instance, or 2 whales who are friends, because the whole process of the preparation and the transfer and the acclimation to a new environment is less stressful if you are doing it with someone that you know. We can't guarantee that will always be the case, but certainly in an ideal world, that would be the case. But that doesn't mean that we wouldn't take a single individual. I mean, it will just be on a case-by-case basis. Part of it is just that individual's personality, how resilient they are, how they react to stress, and just all of those things taken into account.
A couple other questions, just so we don't leave them unanswered. Would you have security 24/7 around a sanctuary? Absolutely, both on the water and on the land. There's the design is for that, and also you must have security at all times. So there's always people on site. And there's always security both on the water and on land for that. And then another question that comes up frequently, and certainly we want to respond to, is how do you prevent whales from having offspring? What are you doing for birth control and the like? Because certainly the concept of having sanctuaries is not to have more whales in any kind of a captive environment, and a sanctuary is a captive environment. So certainly we would not look to have any breeding. So where there is potential for breeding, you use birth control. You use the same methods of birth control that are used in marine parks. They do work, and all of that would be continued if there were males and females in the same area. It could be that they would all be females or all be males. That's not yet clear. That would make that issue certainly easier. But to the extent there is any issues around breeding, there would be birth control to prevent that from continuing.
Absolutely.
Then there's another question. I don't know whether it relates to Toki or whether it relates to our sanctuary in general, but is the ultimate goal release into the open ocean?
Right, right.
And so I think, the answer is no. The answer is, in almost all of these cases, the expectation is that the whales will be cared for their lives. And when you take the first whale, you have to be prepared to care for it for its life. Now, that's been a big question, and the news around the whole issue with Tokatai has been, well, she's being released. She'll go back to LPOD. Well, we have to be prepared to care for her life and give her 24/7 care forever. We want to do that in the best environment we can. Miami Seaquarium is not that. And that's why the impetus is to return her to a netted enclosure in the Pacific Northwest, which is her home waters. And a lot of people feel the dream is to release her. But I think that has to wait until she shows us what she's capable of, and also what's possible in that environment with the southern residents. She and the southern residents are an endangered species. So nothing can be done that would jeopardize that group of whales. So would they, perhaps, if she were released, change their behavior to take care of a matriarch? Could she learn to travel 100 miles a day? All of those are questions that can be answered, but not at the beginning. You start out with the plan to care for her forever. And if over time there's an opportunity for her or any other whale on an individual case-by-case basis to be considered for reintroduction to the wild, you look at that at the time with the appropriate authorities and do everything responsibly every step of the way. And I think it's premature to consider any of that. And it is not the intent of a sanctuary to be a reintroduction path. It is to care for the whales in the best possible way forever, for their lifetimes. And I think perhaps, that's where to end this, because that's what this is all about. It's about taking care of whales, and it's about each individual whale as an individual being. We have to treat them all individually. We have to make the decisions to the best of our ability about them as individuals, because that's what this is all about.
Yeah, and we will continue to work to give back as much as we can to these animals who have given us so much, and have entertained us, have been kept in ways that they shouldn't be. But we can give back. We can give back as much as we possibly can by creating sanctuaries, by educating new generations coming up, by working with people who want to talk about changing the conversation. And it really is, as Charles said beautifully, it's all about the whales. So, we really appreciate all of your questions and you joining us tonight. And feel free to send us other questions and we'd be happy to answer them.
And as we end, thank all of you.
Yes.
It's all of you who make this possible in so many ways. And we appreciate all of your support,
Yes.
all of your interest, and frankly, all of your engagement. I mean,
Yes.
we are the luckiest people in the world. We get to do this kind of work, and we want to enjoy doing that with all of you, and hope you'll continue to be involved with us in every way. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Be well, everyone.